there is set to be a major change in how long migrants must be housed in the Big Apple. The New York Times is now reporting that after 30 days, adult migrants will not be allowed to reapply for housing.
So New York is giving asylum seekers 30 days to move out. But where are thousands of people totally dependent upon the government for everything supposed to just suddenly move to and survive? Nobody's gonna like the answer to that question.
Hundreds of people taking over the intersection of 25th Avenue and 86th Street to stop a homeless shelter from opening.
Towards the end of last year, City Hall says they were receiving as many as 4,000 migrants a week. Since then, the surge has slowed, but city officials believe it might pick back up again in the summer.
Last week, I believe it was 1,300, which is still a lot of people, but now we've been able to adjust with over 200 sites.
This video shows the cramped sleeping conditions. Officials ultimately determined the conditions were unsafe.
It's just going to cause more problems than we already have.
But we are still seeing about 2 to 3 buses a day still coming into New York City.
Homeless shelters don't help homeless people, and we are not going to be silent about it. So the city is now moving asylum seekers into apartments that it pays for. But this program only applies to families, and what nobody's talking about is that the city has zero plans to provide for the thousands of single adults that it's been caring for months, but suddenly wishes weren't here for some reason. And now the city's essentially saying to these people, go, live your life, be free, except they can't actually do that. And that's almost as bad of a plan as telling people they can come here and live in a shelter forever, which was the first plan and was completely unsustainable. And critics are saying the reaction to that, these forced evictions and homelessness, is just going to create more problems for the city because they're following up one bad decision with another bad decision. And you've got human beings on the other end of this that were essentially misled, and now we're in a very tough position. Because after you apply for asylum, if you get on a bus and leave, you've got to amend all of your application paperwork, and that could cause you to get denied. And that's why even though the city's telling people they've got to go, most people are gonna try to stay. And this has people suggesting the city may have just made the whole asylum crisis worse. And to understand why people are saying that, you've got to realize that the folks who are now getting evicted are faced with the worst of choices for what they're going to do next. So this here is the St. Bridget Academy. It's where people who've been evicted from shelters can go to either reapply and try to get an exemption, or where they can go to get a plane ticket or a bus ticket anywhere in the world. But since you can no longer reapply for shelter, and the only thing most people are going to get from here is a plane ticket somewhere else, there's no one waiting in line behind these barricades. And this is quite a different scene from how things have been in months past. And it makes you wonder, if people aren't able to get housing here but they want to stay in the city, where are they finding places to live?
New tonight. Now, a small business owner in Queens, busted for cramming dozens of migrants into 2 illegal shelters, says that he has a new plan to house them legally.
He's subletting to a group of African migrants, some of them unloading their luggage tonight after a long bus.
So here we have a business owner who's got an apartment that they've set up for people who can't get help from the city anymore. But the reason he's on the news is because his last shelter was in an illegal furniture store with 70 beds inside of it. A commercial space like this, no one's supposed to live here because it's not an apartment, but it had been set up with bunk beds and sheets and everything. People were paying $300 for a spot in a bunk. But the thing nobody's talking about is that 180,000 people have come here since this crisis began. And they came because they were under the impression the city was going to take care of them for as long as it took for asylum applications to clear. But now the city has suddenly said, you know what, we're not going to help anybody anymore. And that has left a lot of people in a really tough situation. And even though the new apartment this individual has looks fine, take a look at what experts think might still be out there as an option of last resort people are now turning to.
This video shows the cramped sleeping conditions. The city said complaints led them to SAR and the migrants. Officials ultimately determined the conditions were unsafe.
You know, with so many vacant commercial stores in New York, this is definitely not a one-off scenario. And the way that these illegal shelters are getting discovered is you'll find a whole bunch of e-bikes or mopeds parked outside. And you'll see lots of people coming out of a building that shouldn't really have anything going on inside of it. And the thing is, spaces like this are all over town. But as bad as this might sound, it's not that different from how the city's own shelters are run. The only difference is they've got the city's stamp of approval. But that approval came with a lot of loopholes and corner cutting. One particular facility in Gowanus, Brooklyn, is on a parcel of land so toxic, private apartment development was never allowed there. But then, because of the humanitarian emergency, they greenlit the project and allowed people to put a shelter there. And research reveals that particular landlord has a history of building homeless shelters for the city and is pretty well connected. So he's making money. The guy with the illegal shelters is making money. The only difference is one is city approved and one isn't. But if people are trying to stay in the city, this might be their only option. And it's scary to think that all of the people the city is no longer helping could end up in exploitative situations. That's the sad reality of this situation. Whether you agree with how the city's handling this crisis or not, the people that came here thought they were going to get help, and then suddenly, yoink, the help is gone.
Towards the end of last year, City Hall says they were receiving as many as 4,000 migrants a week. Since then, the surge has slowed, but city officials believe it might pick back up again in the summer.
So the new total, 184,000 asylum seekers, and the news reporters speculate more people are coming. And that's likely because even though the rules for who can stay in a shelter and for how long have changed, New York is going to remain a top destination for those seeking asylum. Because even though the city's only letting people stay in shelters for 30 days now, there's still a massive support network here for people who may not speak the language and need help filing paperwork. And look at all the different languages the instructions are written on here. This is an international city, and there's a very good chance folks that come here from somewhere else will be able to connect with a local community that can help them throughout this process as well. Which means even after all these changes to the shelter system, New York is still going to be bearing a lot of this crisis. And the more I look into this crisis, the more it just seems like a total trap for the very people it's supposed to assist. For example, how are 70,000 people who can't work and who may not have a college degree or even English proficiency, how are they supposed to get a job to afford the expensive rents here? And on top of that, the city's own housing laws that are supposed to protect vulnerable renters have an unintended byproduct of disincentivizing landlords from taking a risk on folks who may have just been in the shelter system, which means they might never find their own apartments, even though the city's now telling them they have to in 30 days.
Some migrants claiming asylum can work right away depending on where they are coming from. Many can't. That forces many migrants into an informal labor economy to try to make ends meet, finding jobs such as...
So the problem that a lot of asylum seekers have when they look for an apartment is that New York is so pro-tenant, landlords are strict. And they want a lot of proof of how much you make and what your credit score is before they'll move you in. Because in this city, after you live somewhere for 30 days, you have the legal right to that property and the landlord can't evict you. Yes, in New York, you have squatters' rights. Now, this doesn't mean asylum seekers will turn into squatters if they get an apartment, but it does mean many landlords aren't willing to take that risk just in case it's there. And these laws that are supposed to protect people actually make it harder for the needy to find a place to live. And it's enough of a nightmare for people that are born and raised in this country with a full-time job and a salary and established credit to get a place. Oftentimes, people that make enough money for something will get told no for having less than perfect credit. And what if you've just moved here? You don't even have credit, and now the city's telling you that in 30 days you've got to go and find a place? And how is someone with an off-the-books job at a little restaurant supposed to prove they make enough to afford rent? And compounding this problem for asylum seekers is that New York is in the middle of a housing crisis. Only 1% of the city's apartments are available to be rented. And now people are being told to leave a shelter and go compete for apartments against somebody who works at Google and might want to rent that same apartment. Is it any wonder why people are winding up in abandoned storefronts, paying money to sleep in an IKEA bunk bed with 70 other people? Terrible, horrendous option, but people are actually finding help in one of the most unlikeliest of places.
The auditorium of the Reformed Church of Highland Park holds the promise of a future in the United States. The church finds the landlords and guarantees the funds. They're the mediator between the landlord and the tenant, with the promise that soon the person will be up and running on their own.
Interesting thing about this, it's a church in New Jersey, but New Jersey's just across the water from New York. People may be able to live in an apartment there and still come back to the shelter here to get their mail. And a real apartment is definitely preferable to an illegal store or basement apartment. And the church is taking care of the paperwork problem by guaranteeing the rent of everybody they place. But unfortunately, rents in New York are so expensive, this church would probably go broke if they tried that.
The process decentralizes the migrant intake and most importantly, encourages people to put down roots, find work, pay taxes, and
You know, this church-run housing operation, this sounds way better than the shelters and the illegal shelters, because it's doing the one thing no homeless shelter does, which is that it's requiring a level of accountability on behalf of the person that it's helping. But this actually brings up another issue nobody's talking about, which is that New York is America's most expensive city. This is the worst possible place you could be trapped, even if you've got an unlimited stay in a city-run shelter.
The migrant crisis is sort of like the frosting on top of an existing affordability crisis that is here in New York and in other cities. We want people to have a safe place to sleep at night.
So there you have it. The sad fact of the matter is that no matter what the city tells people to do, their ability to do it in America's most expensive city, where rents recently hit $5,600 a month, is probably impossible. Even folks living here that make $100,000 a year are only left with around $36,000 of spending power after taxes and rent, and most of New York is broke. And it's not just that rents here are insane and unaffordable. When you go to the grocery store and you try to buy something to feed yourself, that costs more as well, because the rent for that business is expensive. All of the fees the business has to pay to exist are higher here than elsewhere, plus you've got city taxes. And not only is inflation worse here than it is in most parts of the country, prices keep going up even on basic city services like its broken transportation network. And that's why it just seems so crazy that the city created a population of people that were reliant on it for its help, and now it's told them, hey, go figure it out. How are they gonna do that? And how exactly does it benefit people to be trapped in New York City with no way to provide for themselves? We know it benefits the system of buses and trains and planes that bring people here. We know it benefits the homeless shelter complex, which houses people. But how exactly does it benefit the people who are dependent upon it? Even the families that are still able to reside in shelters without eviction. How is it helping them to be there forever?
A lot of the migrants are dealing with a lot of depression because of the treatment that the city is giving them. They feel like there's no one that is going to help them anymore.
Now here's where the real problem lies. It's in this system that brought people here and then suddenly cut them off. Obviously, New York cannot house everyone forever. Everyone should have known that going into this, but now that we all know, there's still no exit strategy. And this is gonna lead to people doing things they would rather not to try and survive. And many asylum seekers feel misled by this whole process. The promise of coming here and getting back on your feet with a job never materialized. Just ask the people who now have to leave the shelter system and don't have a job that pays enough for an apartment. Now, I'm not advocating that New York should continue to house everybody forever. They can't. But it's almost like nobody running the shelter system thought about what was going to happen to the people in it when it suddenly stopped supporting them. And it's almost as if this entire system was designed from the very beginning to fail for some reason. So unfortunately, here at the police precinct / impound lot for mopeds, we see signs of a system that is totally failing the people it's supposed to help. And a broken system is why you have so many confiscated illegal mopeds, which were being used by people to commit crime.
Police say it is a sophisticated ring that started back in November.
So far, police have arrested 7 people connected to the robberies, but there are still others on the loose, including the alleged ringleader. CBS 2's Allie Bauman live now.
So the leader of this gang, when he was eventually caught, he told the authorities that the criminal underworld in New York was much bigger than him in his single operation, which spanned 3 different states. And the crime ring he was leading could only exist in a city like New York because it's got a large population of vulnerable people gangs can try to exploit. And the thieves in this gang used these mopeds to steal purses and phones from New Yorkers walking down the street, which they would then bring back to their hideout, which was also an apartment building that had a whole bunch of rooms in it where they would break into the phones and drain people's bank accounts. It's incredibly frightening. And it's unfortunate that New York's humanitarian crisis is being taken advantage of by criminals.
Police say over the past 3 months, this group has mostly targeted women walking alone and have made themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen profit.
Surveillance video.
Now, the other thing about New York, which is why it's so easy for illegitimate operations like this to thrive, is the soft on crime policies that critics say exist here. For example, you can steal under $1,000 worth of stuff and it's only a misdemeanor. which is not a jailable, bailable offense. Critics say laws like this hamstring how much police can do to protect the general public. And to the criminals on the bikes, every single person walking down the street is essentially a bank. And if there aren't any consequences for robbing people, people are going to continue to get robbed. And this brings us back to our original question. Is the system of homeless shelters and all of the businesses that are making money on this designed to actually help people, or is it doing something much worse?
Assemblyman William Colton represents this district.
This is the wrong place and it's the wrong policy. Homeless shelters don't help homeless people, and we are not going to be silent about it.
So this occurred at a rally in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where a new shelter was being set up. And even though the city is passing laws to limit shelter stays, they're still expanding the system by renting out new buildings and signing new contracts whenever they can. And I don't want to see people who have nothing ending up on the street. That's terrible. But how are we going to succeed in New York if we expand a system that makes people homeless? And are systems like this leading to good outcomes for people? Or are they actually trapping people and messing up their lives further? And critics say a lot of well-meaning people in New York have actually misplaced their compassion because these expensive systems that take care of everything for some people aren't really helping them. And many people are wondering, what is the end game for a system that brings people here but doesn't allow them to support themselves? And as great as it is that people aren't sleeping on the streets, the shelter system's not educating people and teaching them how to move out of that very same system. But what do you think the city should do in terms of this crisis? Should the city expand the homeless shelter system? Or should they change what it does so that it actually helps people get on their feet and provide for themselves? And if they did that, what exactly would it look like? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.